Hey everyone, it's Bob Pulver. Welcome back to Elevate Your AIQ. Today's episode, I'm thrilled to be joined by Noelle London, founder and CEO of Illoominus. Noelle's been at the intersection of innovation and HR tech for over a decade, leading ventures at Accenture, investing in startups, and now building a platform to help companies turn messy, siloed HR data into clear people insights. Noelle and I explore how organizations can connect the dots across the employee journey, elevate their data, analytics, and AI maturity, and break down silos between teams like talent acquisition, talent management, and people analytics. We also talk about what it truly means to build human-centered organizations in the age of AI and why responsible, fair use of technology is everyone's job. Thanks as always for listening. Let's dive in. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Elevate Your AIQ. I am your host, Bob Pulver. With me today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Noelle London. How are you doing today, Noelle?
Doing great. Thanks for having me, Bob, and it's great to reconnect.
Yes, absolutely. We had a couple false starts in the fall.
Third time's a charm.
That's being nice to myself, who had some user error, and then of course the significant volume in the expo of HR tech just was not our friend. So anyway, it's great to have you. I thought to kick off our discussion, you could just give a bit of about your background and what led you to found Illoominus.
Sure. Well, hi, everybody. My name's Noelle London. As Bob mentioned, I'm the founder and CEO of Illoominus. And prior to launching Illoominus, I've spent about a decade or more in and around startups, wearing lots of different hats. I've been an investor. I've launched incubator type programs. But most recently, I was over at Accenture leading their ventures program and managing their HR technology partnerships. And so essentially in that role, what I was able to do was work with the latest and greatest startups that were building new future of work technologies, taking those into my Fortune 2000 clients, which was a lot of fun to see. And we'll even get into in this conversation, I'm sure, on AI upskilling and reskilling. Got to see great technology, but I think there were quite a few things and market signals that really led us to launch Illoominus. First one was, I was there during 2020 after the murder of George Floyd and others. It was also a time where the role of HR was being completely redefined. And the big thing that I was seeing is that, as responsibilities were changing, HR leaders were being asked to play a more strategic role. The reality is that the tools and resources didn't exist to actually bring that data together to tell the whole story. And so I think, it was one part underlying data foundation issue. And we can, I'm sure we're going to spend a whole lot of time on that in this conversation today. And part two, being there and seeing this very real use case of we need to be able to look at our employees holistically, those employees that are underrepresented within our teams right now, and just seeing that, there was a lot of need for accountability and for reporting, and the toolkit didn't really exist. And so that's ultimately the signals we saw and ultimately what led us to launch the company.
Awesome. So I think we're definitely going to hit on a lot of those
All of that.
topics.
You and I,
Yeah,
every time we get together too, there's so much to cover in such a short amount of time.
yeah, absolutely. So I think on the data and analytics front, I definitely see, well, I guess I'll flip it to you. I mean, do you see with your clients and prospects that people are getting smarter about breaking down some of those sort of data silos? Are they, sort of rethinking about the metrics that they're tracking? I mean, how do you see, your target sort of market and buyers? How do you see their own sort of maturation occurring?
Just to give some context before I get into that, because I didn't mention before, but just to tell you a little bit about what we do at Illoominus, we are a turnkey people insights platform. So essentially what we do is we sit on top of disparate HR tech stacks. We bring all of that data together into one place to map out the employee journey, but also to help an organization understand how they're doing relative to their peers. And so I think that, Bob, to your question and to your point of how are we seeing this evolve, I absolutely see that more and more companies, this is one of the biggest challenges they're trying to figure out this year. I think that we've just seen that increase year over year of, hey, I was kicking the can down the road on the data front. It's something I've really got to figure out. And so we're seeing that more and more companies are prioritizing this. They're hiring up on their teams to really solve for it. In terms of the maturity itself, as a, corporate innovation type person, I always think of this as like an S curve of, where somebody is on this maturity curve. And, are we at a point of like, are we even able to do regular reporting that we feel confident in to share with our leadership? Or are we at a place where, we're getting into more prescriptive analytics? And, you can kind of break down the like descriptive, predictive, prescriptive kind of stages along the journey. Honestly, what I'm seeing is typically companies are not where they think they are on that maturity curve. We find that some companies think that they're a whole lot further than they actually are. And sometimes we find that there's underlying data foundation issues for some of those companies that do have the analytics. They almost, maybe didn't do the foundational steps, and they're finding those things later on in their journeys. I also have a lot of companies that we talk to and work alongside with that really think that they're in a worse place than they actually are. The reality is that most companies we're seeing, they're running into the same things. And it's, they're like, oh, I'm embarrassed to show you my data. And then when you get in there, you're like, you're in the same exact place as everybody else is. And so, that data cleanup, that data health portion is a big part of the process with all of these companies. But, maturity wise, I think that there's higher ambitions and expectations than there has been in the past. I think there's more of an emphasis on the importance of it. I still think it is a journey in terms of maturity, but we do see more companies are starting to kick off that process.
Nice. Okay. Well, that's a good sign. I'm sure your benchmarking is helping them, realize just, well, wherever they fall on that scale, right? We're behind or we're ahead, we're all good, whatever. Benchmarking gives them that reality check and says, look, you've got some of the foundational elements here, but you still need to think about how you might look for, correlations across, some of these currently disparate, data sets, or, have you thought about combining, this with that? This has come up a lot with some of the communities that I'm a part of as it relates to like talent intelligence and people analytics, which are currently in a lot of cases, if companies even have the resources for both of those separate teams, they're not necessarily talking to each other yet, which is problematic if you're thinking about your total talent, sort of visibility, right? And then that short changes you when you start to think about doing the strategic part of strategic workforce planning and all of these other things that could be enabled.
Yeah, I think that that's the piece. There's a couple of good points in there on you're talking about the benchmarking. And I think that that is a really good that's one of the things that we care a lot about. I would say typically we're going to tend to work with and have more experience with what we call a mid-market company. So like, the 20,000 employees and less that typically don't have this fully built team. They don't have their resources available to have people analytics. And so that's really where we see the opportunity is how do we bring these best practices to those organizations that maybe haven't been able to invest in this before and really give that market context. Case in point is, you look at, let's say, the retail industry, which typically has extremely high turnover. And, working with a retailer that, is looking at their data and saying like, oh, wow, am I replacing my 70% of my employees every 90 days? And, you get in there and you look back and say like, hey, you're doing better. There are things that you're learning and that you're improving upon to bring down your turnover rates. But then we can put the benchmarks in front of them and say, like, actually, it's also tied to the overall market. And so all of your peers are also seeing decreased attrition and turnover. And so some of those things where having that context actually gives you, hey, you may be pretty high on turnover, but that's typical to what we're seeing in the industry. What is something that you've been doing and learning about, like, say, improved scheduling or providing benefits that maybe you didn't before, learning and development type opportunities? What are the things that truly, like, your business is doing to improve those numbers versus what's actually happening in the market? And is it tied to that? So giving that context can be really important. And just what you were saying, Bob, as well, on the talent journey and looking at the talent pipeline, I think that that's the thing that we get the most excited about at Illoominus right now is being able to connect that employee journey. You're just talking about sometimes you've got fantastic talent intelligence within an organization, but that group isn't talking to somebody else. So that data is not necessarily being used to its highest value. I think that's kind of one of the things that we've continued to see is that these HR teams can be pretty siloed because you can see, a talent acquisition leader has very different goals and metrics than an employee engagement person. And sometimes, if we're not connecting that journey, then the HR team at times might not be working together and as effectively as possible. And so by connecting the employee journey and connecting these points across the employee journey, that's allowing us to answer these really interesting questions like, what is a high performer? Where does a high performer come from within our organization? Once somebody comes in, and I know I mentioned retail before, but, we can go back to that of like, if I, had somebody on the store floor and they end up growing into a leadership position or they're, jump over into corporate, can I better understand what happened there? And can I learn from that? Because there's so many good examples that might be anecdotes, but we haven't necessarily had the data to be able to map that journey so that that is learned and that then feeds back into the overall organization. So I think that, connected journey is something that's really exciting. When I think also about, previous roles where maybe I was asked to take an employee engagement survey, I think about times where maybe I didn't feel super comfortable with answering that honestly, because it was, who's going to look and slice and dice this data in certain ways? Am I going to be penalized because I'm sharing my opinion? I think that's something also of like where it starts to get exciting and interesting of like some of these key things that we've been doing in HR, like giving employee engagement surveys. Is it actually giving us what we need right now? And I would argue maybe not if like employee experience is just looking at this engagement survey and the TA team's looking at time to hire versus like if we're looking at like if ultimately the whole reason we're doing all of this is we're trying to create high performing teams, then we can't look at these data points in silos anymore. It's more like if I'm trying to know what is a high performing team, managers continue to come up with HR leaders of like, how do I create a strong manager? And then when you can start to look at your organization and say, let's look at the whole organization and let's pull together attrition numbers next to performance numbers, next to engagement numbers. That starts to tell us a very different story and a very different picture of what's actually working within the organization, because maybe Noelle didn't answer that engagement survey honestly, and maybe Noelle left a month or two after that engagement survey. That tells us a very different thing. If we're seeing engagement surveys are fine, no one's answering, but we're seeing that people are leaving or we're seeing that performance is dropping, those types of things. So that's something I get really excited about is the opportunity there with connecting that data But I'm sure we'll get into it on with AI and automation of this is also foundational for people to be doing right now so that as organizations are evolving and roles and needs of organizations are evolving, that you actually have the ability to better understand how people are moving through the organization and how you should be helping to move them through the organization.
Wow. Okay. So much to unpack there, Noelle. I mean, I'm not even sure where to begin. I'm gonna try to rattle off a couple things and get your reaction. First, if TA, I've seen some examples recently where people are talking about like the evolution of talent acquisition, and TA leaders are trying to get their teams to become more like, talent advisors as you start to bring in, AI, agents and automation into the flow, and how do you sort of elevate the game, as it were, of recruiters and other folks on your team, maybe even into recruiting operations as well, rec ops. And so, but one of the things that's come up recently is like,
Welcome to the Human Role, your go-to podcast where HR and payroll collide with innovation. I'm your host, Tiana Neal, and every month I'm diving deep with industry experts and change makers, bringing you real talk insights, practical tips, and fresh takes you won't hear anywhere else. Whether you're a leader, practitioner, or just curious about the latest HR and payroll trends, I've got you covered. Ready to roll with the best? Tune in for fresh perspectives, actionable tips, and the knowledge you need to roll forward with confidence. Subscribe now and let's transform the way you work.
these TA leaders can't just be looking outward. I mean, I know we've been talking about that for a while, that you need this 360-degree view because, the talent that you need may already be, on your payroll, right? And so you've got to have that sort of swivel chair kind of mentality. But if the metrics are not aligned and you're just focused on, recruiting efficiency, right? Time to hire, time to fill, those kinds of things, or you're not thinking about, both quality of hire as well as sort of repurposing talent, as an asset, then you're not necessarily aligned with others within the organization on some of the metrics that actually matter. And so one of the things about, the upskilling that you mentioned at the beginning is this isn't necessarily about upskilling in terms of like data and analytics maturity and going down that path. It's more about understanding from an AI literacy and an AI readiness standpoint, what is what can current AI, and as AI evolves, you got to pay attention to that too. But what types of tasks and competencies do these AI tools, take on? Because increasingly you're going to have the people who hold the purse strings up to the CFO. Maybe they start to ask questions like, before I approve this new rec that you think you need a human being, wherever that human being may be sourced from, maybe I need to understand, has technology advanced to the point that we can trust, an algorithmic, solution, or some type of automation to do a lot of what you're asking like a person to do. So I just feel like everyone's got to up their game. It's not just the individual contributors; it's the leaders that need to understand and have a better sense of how fast things are moving, how quickly the organization is willing to, invest in technology as well as people, and sort of, you know, help with healthy growth, I guess I would describe it, right? So that you're not just throwing more people at a problem, but it becomes part of the strategic planning kind of, equation. And so you need to have that knowledge, but you also need to be collaborating, across some of these HR domains, talent management and talent acquisition for starters, so that people in doing workforce analytics or people analytics looking inward, and the talent intelligence folks who are typically looking outward at, skills gaps, understanding, compensation for different roles, actual job movement of different people and different skills and roles or whatever. So there's a lot to start to pay attention to, but the more you sort of mature the organization to, put some of those pieces together and get some of the, enable the collective intelligence of some of these groups across those silos, which need to be broken down. There's a lot that you can sort of unleash when you get that data to the surface and people can interrogate it. So, and just before you react to that, just before I lose my thought on the survey thing, I spent a lot of time at IBM doing like social analytics, and you've got to complement these point in time, potentially emotional, potentially inaccurate, surveys, which are typically only done on like maybe an annual basis, with some anonymized and aggregated like sentiment and trending topics across different groups, so that you've got more of a persistent pulse of how employees are feeling, because you don't want to wait till like someone hands in their resignation or you're in the exit interview to find out that there were things that you could have fixed and now it's too late.
Yeah, I mean, and I definitely want to make sure we get back to the like AI and HR and how do we help HR leaders today. But to pull more on what you're saying, I think you're absolutely right. Talent acquisition potentially right now doesn't have the right incentives in place. And so that's what we're, if that's what you're incentivizing is time to hire, like you're disincentivizing this internal mobility opportunity that's so massive and huge. And so I think that piece of TA and talent management working together, I think there's a lot in conversations we're having. I think there's a lot more of an emphasis there of how we get that synergy working there. But I think, not just even about, AI tools for HR, but thinking about, this connected data and why it is so important. It's massive because if I think the IMF said like 40% of jobs are going to be impacted based on AI, and that's conservative, but 40% of jobs are going to be impacted. It doesn't necessarily mean that those jobs go away, but it does mean that the roles are changing and they're changing real time. So that CEO that you were mentioning, I believe that was Spotify, said something earlier this week of we don't hire for a new job unless we know that AI can't do that job. And what that leader is saying is that performance is now also measured on how much AI someone is using within their role. That's now a KPI for a lot of organizations. And so what that means is like today, the way the HR systems are set up is Noelle is hired for this job. The HR systems, because they're not connecting the employee journey and because we're not looking at data holistically, it's really hard to say Noelle has these skills and that job and that strategic initiative that Noelle was working on is no longer our highest priority. So how do we take Noelle and move Noelle into her next role that is most appropriate? And that motion is going to become so increasingly important of we want to find high performers, but we want to move these high performers through the organization as we need them in different seats and in different places because things are changing so quickly. And so that's such a massive opportunity right in front of us. So when we go back to, readiness, of that's the kind of shift that we're going to see. What we have to be doing right now is connecting that data and connecting that employee journey so that we're ready to start thinking about, not Noelle is in her job, what was her start date, what was in her end date. It was how does Noelle move throughout the organization and how do we become more agile on how we're thinking about that?
Yeah, no, I love it. The internal mobility thing hits home because throughout my corporate career, which was first 25 years or so of my career, like that was huge. And if you didn't have Like not every company has the technology to help facilitate some of that or to elevate someone's visibility. I mean, at IBM, we were sort of spoiled with all of the toys being, knowledge graphs and expertise discovery tools, and you know, even even your profile in the directory was editable by you, and people could tag other people's profiles. So it wasn't just this like HRIS thing that only 5 people in the company could touch, right? You could augment the standard sort of profiles with all this, enriched, data that says these people, you could see how many times you were tagged by other people for a given subject, right? And so that helped differentiate between, topics that someone might just like be interested in versus something that they actually have expertise. And so there were, and peer-to-peer, validation tools, peer-to-peer learning tools, or whatever. So you were never more than a few keystrokes away or 2 degrees away from finding resources that could help you in context, right, in the flow of what you were doing. And but I mean, at NBC, just to pick on them a little bit, I got there and that that whole toy chest was gone, right? Like you had to know who knew who and who knew what, and build like completely build your connections and your relationships and everything from scratch. And so when it comes to new opportunities, whether that's extracurricular sort of side projects and stuff like that, or your next like full-time role, it puts you at a disadvantage. You just don't, the data isn't available to enough people who could connect those dots and say, look at all these transferable skills that this person has. They're totally capable of doing this other role, and increasingly that's going to be important because you're right. Not AI is not going to hit every role, and certainly not going to hit every role at the same time. But these are, we need to be building dynamic, adaptive, organizations, and that means we're looking for people who can roll with those, who can ebb and flow, right? Who can roll with those punches as things change, and they can figure out how to sort of either reskill or upskill, their own capabilities. And some of those capabilities are, working directly with, some of these AI tools to make them more productive and effective, right? This isn't just a productivity thing. This is how do we build effectiveness in our teams and our organizations, and part of that might be recognizing where there's a gap that could be filled by moving the chess pieces around.
Yeah, yeah. And I love that you brought up, IBM and all of the tools and toys that you had to be able to answer some of these questions. And I think it's really, interesting that a company like that has all of those tools and toys, but it's like I would argue probably over 90% of companies don't have that. And they don't have the resources to do that either. It's like they don't have the resources to buy those kinds of tools. They don't have the people and the headcount to build those kinds of tools. And so that's, a big thing that we think about a lot is, how do we leapfrog these companies that have never been able to afford these types of tools? So they've gone for a really long time and too long of a time without those answers. And how can we, is this an opportunity to bring that type of tooling to those companies? Because you even think of like, okay, so IBM's a services company. And when you look at AI adoption, it's first in the tech industry and it's second in the services industry. As you go further down and you start looking at industries like retail or like hospitality, those are actually our biggest employers, at least within the US, are those kinds of industries, but they're also lagging the most on AI adoption, but they're touching so many more people than some of these other industries are. And it's like, maybe they've had tooling that focuses on customer data and on, if you're in a rewards program at a retailer, like they know what you're going to buy before you know what you're going to buy. It's like they have that maturity on that part of the organization. But it's also like if there are our biggest employers and their people are their biggest cost of the business, but they can't tell you what's going on with those people, that's also just a really big opportunity because a lot of those retailers are the ones that are asking, and saying like our focus is on profitability this year. And they, they know what you're buying before you know what you're buying, but the employee data hasn't been invested in. And so if you're thinking about profitability, it's also, one of your biggest opportunities. So I get excited about that of these other industries that traditionally, are impacting a lot of people's lives and a lot of workers' lives, but haven't had that data to say, like, maybe I've been spending on hiring people as opposed to spending on like listening to my employees so I'm keeping them, which ultimately saves my company money and makes sure that the employee experience is better. I get really excited about that opportunity.
Yeah, I think most companies are not doing a great with that. They're just they're reactive, right? They're like they'll attribute it to external factors. It's the economy. It's millennials. It's they'll find some other sort of scapegoat. But there's a lot of data that you could interrogate. I mean, I think about it honestly from personal experience. Like I get apprehensive sometimes if I with my smartwatch or like fitness trackers and quantifying everything that I did. Like I don't, I don't really want to see how much time I spent on an app on a Saturday or something like that, because I'll just be mad at myself for doom scrolling or playing a game or something like that. So I don't know. On some level, I feel like organizations are some of them at least are like maybe they just are so used to they're so set in their ways, like they're reluctant to look and sort of quantify all the things that could be quantified. It's not like the data is not there; it could be captured, and maybe people just don't want to see it because it ties to a loss of agency to a degree and like their own decision making power. Like it's like instinct versus you know data and reality, right? Do you actually not trust the data? If so, let's dig into that. But if the data's there and you trust people who have built the systems and you trust that it's coming out of a system of record, right, which is supposed to be the source of truth. Like if you don't believe that, we need to have a different conversation. But if you're just reluctant to use it because you trust your gut or you instinctively as a hiring manager know what success, looks like, that's a different situation. So I wanted to ask you about like human centricity is a big topic. I personally spent a lot of time in that space. And what I mean by that is, are we bringing like AI and automation into an organization to accomplish certain things to improve, accuracy, speed, efficiency types of, metrics, but are we doing it maintaining people and assuming that organizations are a collection of people with common goals, right? And it's not just, human oversight over, everything, just basically, sort of robotic and, digital labor and things like that. But I really think about, are we making fair decisions about people's, lives and livelihoods and their potential? Are we understanding what they need to be successful? Things along those lines. And sometimes we use the phrase, human in the loop, but that almost implies we are just in that sort of oversight. Well, let's just make sure, the robots don't go crazy or take over or do anything to harm, humans in some way. But I guess one of the things I've been thinking about as I sort of dig deeper into this space as sort of an offshoot of my responsible AI focus, which I know we'll talk about is everything that has recently transpired around like DEI initiatives, which in a fundamental way are about, fairness and meritocracy and treating people with dignity and respect and all of that, but also, mitigating, adverse impact or whatever. As we go down this sort of human centric or people first kinds of, approaches, do we by default have to sort of take on that mantle that was DEI? I'm just trying to anticipate some of the pushback and headwinds that, like, well, that sounds all nice, but you've basically just rebranded, DEI. You took the acronym away, but it's all basically there.
Maybe, but I also believe that it has to look different. I not to get too much into it, but a DEI in many ways that was somebody's job. And that's, I think, where a lot of the challenge stemmed from, is that it was somebody's job that didn't have a lot of authority, didn't have a lot of budget, and has a massive weight put on them to undo structures and systems. And so when it's hard, because it is hard, it's also easy. It was easy, and I don't know if that's not the right word, but it was let go. And I think in this case, this human centricity, the fairness, it can't be somebody's job. It can't be an office. It can't be a department. It has to be a part of every single person's job, because it's going to be hard and it's going to continue to be hard. And it's too easy to, when it gets hard, to let somebody go or a department divest from something. And to me, it becomes a part of the guiding principle of how you are implementing AI. Because just as we were talking about before, AI is a part of everybody's job. It's an expectation. It's table stakes now. But we have to go into these decisions. These decisions have such an important impact on people's lives, on who's getting promoted, who's getting hired, all of those things, that this has to be something that it's almost in the same way where I think about Illoominus and I think about how we make decisions. We have values as a company. We have behaviors as a company. And when we're making hard decisions, we think through those lenses to help us make those decisions. And it's almost like this human centricity and fairness. Everybody within the organization, but also everybody on the HR team that's evaluating solutions, being able to put through your decision through a filter of human centricity and fairness, and thinking about, okay, if I were to implement this hiring solution, do I understand like how those decisions are being made? Am I asking the questions? Because the next few years are going to be so critical of what we adopt and what we allow to use. And it's moving fast. Bob, you and I were together like less than a month ago at Transform, and even just like the speed at which you're seeing product launches and everybody running towards AI, it's happening really fast. And so we have to, like, that would be one of the first things I would encourage an HR leader to do, is to think about what's the lens when my team is evaluating solutions, which you should be evaluating to help you get further faster within your roles. But as my team's evaluating solutions before they're coming to me, like, have they thought through this filter of what that solution is going to do for us? And so, not meant to say like not meant to go down like analysis paralysis, because nobody, we have to all adopt these solutions, but setting the standard and setting the expectation that this is a part of everyone's role, especially in HR, as you're making these really important decisions that impact a lot of people's lives. That would be probably one of the first things to do.
No, I love it. I talk a lot about, obviously I talk a lot about responsible AI, human-centric AI, but it's not just how you use it, right? Or when you use it, it's how you design it, right? And so to your point about procuring, new solutions from, Illumina and others, are you asking the right questions? Are you asking the perhaps tougher, questions to make sure that you're not, to make sure that this is a true, like, trusted provider, and that adjective takes on another sort of level of meaning in the age of AI, because you need to make sure that you're not, exacerbating any adverse impact that may already be occurring inside your organization. And, without getting into the whole debate about, algorithmic, bias versus human bias, at least the algorithmic bias could scale. But if you're responsible by design and you're catching it early in the sort of supply chain of this talent data, then you're not sort of contaminating, the downstream, systems with biased data or a biased, model, which is constantly, evolving and changing. And you just have more, confidence that you're mitigating the risk. You're never going to completely eliminate it, because our data is, human, generated. There's bias in that data a lot of times. And so we've just got to think about that when we talk to our vendors, and we've got to talk about it from an AI, upskilling and AI literacy standpoint, that says there's a, if your learning content was, multiple modules, one of those modules at least would be around, this, these responsible AI, concepts. How will I know that I can trust, these solutions? How do I know that it's explainable, that it's, transparent, that it's maintaining data privacy, that it's secure, and all of those things. But, the more we can educate folks about all of these aspects of AI literacy, the better off we're all going to be. And I've typically focused on two segments of the population when it comes to that. One is,
Hey, we're the payroll baddies, and our mission is to make payroll fun and relatable.
And call out industry when we hear it.
You gotta call it out. You gotta call it like you see it. But we also gotta shine a light on all those unsung payroll heroes out there, making sure we get paid.
Yeah, those are the real payroll baddies out there, and we love sharing their stories and showing them love.
With gold chain and everything, baby.
By the way, SAP is the best payroll out there, and if you don't like it,
Get out.
TA and talent acquisition and HR, because you are constantly making decisions about people's lives and livelihoods, and it's not just about who you hire or who you let go. And then the other is the future workforce, students and perhaps their parents and teachers. Are we establishing good habits as people get comfortable and start playing around with some of these tools, which are on all of our devices at this point? So are we showing people that these are the appropriate, use cases? These are the appropriate ways in which we can, build custom tools and use these tools to our advantage, such that they're trusted and they're not creating, adverse impact, and they're not causing harm, I guess,
Yeah.
is one way to think about it.
Which should be an absolutely integral part of any kind of AI training or any kind of AI upskilling, is the responsible AI component, the ethics around how to think through these filters of how might we have gotten to these answers.
Yeah, the education sector, I've been spending more time in, partly for personal reasons, because my daughter's starting to look at colleges. But I know just from the general population that aren't in the spaces that you and I play in, they're just kind of, hacking away, right? It's like the new, Google or Alexa or whatever. And so people just, they use it out of convenience. They trust it, more than they should. So, part of this, an extension of the sort of responsible AI, literacy, is just really understanding how to not outsource your critical thinking in some ways, right? Like, let me think, is that that sound logical? I mean, it comes up all the time. Like if you're asking an AI solution about something that you know nothing about, you're obviously more apt to trust it. Just like if you were to ask, you know, someone who claims to be an expert on a topic or whatever, they're going to give you an answer, and you may not know what it's like. So part of it is just keeping a critical eye on, what you're asking it, and applying some critical thinking and logic to its output to determine whether or not this is trustworthy or not. But that's why I like some of these newer capabilities where it's actually being more transparent about how it's operating, right? It's sort of showing you its reasoning and its logic. It's sort of digital thought pattern, so that you can sort of understand, did it miss some context. And but a good way to test some of these is just ask it a question that you actually know the answer to, and see how close it comes to that right answer, because you'll be surprised. I mean, just go into Chat GPT, ask it about yourself, right? And if it starts making stuff up, I mean, I've done that. It's been a while since I've done it, but I've done it before, and it said I had an MBA from somewhere, which I do not have from anywhere, and it said I did a whole bunch of things that I did not do. So it can be your know-it-all friend sometimes, who has an answer for everything, but that won't necessarily be an accurate response. It'd be nice someday to be like, I actually don't know, but when you find out, come back and tell me so I can
Right. That
add
would
it
be
to my
great.
knowledge base. So yeah, so it's scary though. It's moving really fast, so it's still so early. It'll be really interesting to see how things evolve over the rest of this year. But I know that as we think about, the jobs of the future, you were alluding to that before with the IMF, and I know the World Economic Forum, publishes data on this all the time. We've got to sort of pay attention to what are the skills that are in demand, and make sure we're sort of keeping that in mind as we educate, the future workforce, and as we think about our own, career paths, which are often nonlinear.
Yeah.
Any last thoughts, words of wisdom for the audience, Noelle?
Well, I would say, what we've talked about today, and you and I have talked about this before to each other, is, I really believe this is the big challenge of our times. And it's a whole lot of pressure for these already overwhelmed HR leaders to, have the board and a C-suite pressing down on, well, we should just be using more AI. And we don't necessarily know, we should do some thinking on performance reviews, automating performance reviews and automating hiring processes. And that can be pretty scary. And I think it can be pretty overwhelming to HR leaders. I think you and I said a couple weeks ago at Transform, it was refreshing to hear some skepticism from HR leaders too on, a lot of this with AI. What I would say for now is put aside these big existential questions that we're trying to answer. And what I would say is, if you look at the role of HR over the last 4 to 5 years, sometimes I kind of think it's like instead of a CHRO or a chief people officer, it's like a chief change officer in a way, of just the amount of responsibility. And when nothing has had a good box to put it into, it usually gets put on HR's plate. And so the thing I would encourage anybody listening to think about is, you've taken on so much new workflow in the last couple of years. There are a lot of things that are probably taking too much time of yours right now because it was put on your plate out of necessity and you just had to hack it together out of necessity. But to sit back and think about those 2 to 3 things that you could automate or you could put some AI around, because there are these big questions to answer. But I also think there's enormous opportunity right now for HR leaders to be adopting AI on some of these things that are really time intensive. So You're spending a whole lot of time on alignment across many different stakeholders. That could look like reporting, which is our personal favorite thing to try and automate. But like it could be, you're doing a whole lot of communication with your ELT, with your teams. Like you're pulled into this like alignment communication role quite a bit that can be really time intensive and maybe isn't the best use of you and your skill sets. And so some of the things that are out there that you do need to make sure this is okay with IT and your lawyer, and I'm not either of those for you. But some of the things that like I think about, even what we've been able to do on our side and with our organization is, some of those things that are taking a lot of time, like copywriting, scheduling systems, research on new topics and new, policies and compliance things that you need to be on top of, putting through like note taking. So if somebody's missing meetings, you have like a source and a database where those meetings can be accessed by your team or by your stakeholders. So you're not spending as much time getting people up to speed, connecting different systems so that reminders are sent out and they're not coming from you, document management, some of those workflows. So even if we're not going to tackle the really big questions today, I think there's enormous opportunity to take some of what's been put on your plate and to try and give you back a couple of hours a week so you're, able to do more on a Sunday night, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. You mentioned like companies have the ability to sort of leapfrog in certain ways. And so if you're not ready to take that huge leap because you want to see more trust in some of these systems, then fine, do exactly what you said. Because I mean, some of that is just automation, right? That some companies have been doing for quite a while. I mean, nowadays it's more, I would say it's probably more intelligent, automation, but still not quite full blown, AI or, agentic AI or whatever. But you've got to get started. You've got to start to get comfortable and move forward, because otherwise, competition standpoint, you're going to be at a disadvantage. That might be as a business, as well as in terms of as an employer brand and talent attraction. I think it's important to, the younger generation of workers be at a company that is seen as, paying attention to technology shifts and how that affects, organizational effectiveness and work transformation itself. So I think that's sound advice.
Yeah. Your teams are looking at how you're adopting it. And if you're adopting it, it becomes the expectation and they're adopting it.
Exactly. Well, Noelle, we will leave it there, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon. Hopefully I'll see you at Unleash or one of the other conferences. But thank you so much for spending so much time with me. I think there's a lot of really insightful takeaways from this. So thank you again for your time.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
And thanks for having this conversation and continuing to keep this conversation at the forefront. It's really important.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you again, Noelle, and thank you everyone for listening. We'll see you next time.